Welcome to Righteousness from the Heart, a devotional series based upon the opening statements in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, we call the Beatitudes. The passage before us emphasizes that being right with God involves both attitude and action. And it is in this sense that we use the phrase righteousness from the heart. In our last study, we gave attention to the word blessed, the word that is found at the beginning of each of these Beatitudes. And it is a word that describes the relationship that we can enjoy with God because of the fact that we are right with Him. Because of the atoning death of Jesus, we can be right with God. Listen to the Apostle Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 21, when he writes, "For our sakes he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." And that is what is at the heart of what it means to be blessed. Because we can be saved from sin in Jesus Christ, because we have the blessing of being right with God. And so you could say that our response to that is living righteousness from the heart. So with that as a backdrop, let's read together, beginning in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 1, and read the Beatitudes before we look at them one by one. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." As we begin our study of the Beatitudes, begin in verse number 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In a similar passage, Luke records Jesus saying, "Blessed are ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." That's Luke 6 and verse number 20. And even though there's a difference, poor in spirit in Matthew's account and simply poor in Luke's, the idea is really the same. The emphasis is not upon material possessions or even a lack of material possessions, but in both passages, the emphasis is on the heart. And when Jesus said poor, he had a choice of words. There were different words that could be used. But Jesus chose the word for poor that means helpless, powerless. It is used of one who is reduced to begging for his daily existence. In Luke 16, it is the verse, or the word rather, that Jesus used to describe Lazarus. As he told the story of the rich man and Lazarus, he describes Lazarus as a beggar daily. Lazarus, full of sores, was laid at the rich man's gate so that he could beg for the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. He is a picture of one who is powerless, helpless, destitute, one who is unable to provide for himself. And that is the word picture that Jesus chose. It is important for us to see ourselves as we really are, to see ourselves as we are before God. This poverty of spirit is essential if we ever are to recognize what our true needs are. And here's the reason the Bible warns, at least one of the reasons, the Bible warns against self-deception. In the first chapter of James, twice, James speaks of one who deceives his own heart. In verse number 22, he said, if a man is a hearer of the word, but not a doer of the word, then he deceives his heart. And in verse number 26, if he says that he is a religious man, but he does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his own heart. Think about the description that Jesus gave of the church in Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3 and verse number 17. Listen to what Jesus said of them. For you say, and this is what the church thought of themselves, you say, I am rich, I am prospered, and I need nothing. Not realizing, now here's what Jesus says about that church. You are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Here's a church that thought they had it all together, and yet they had deceived themselves. They were not what they thought they were. They had no power. They had no ability in themselves as they thought they did. In fact, the only power that they had was to make Jesus sick to his stomach. You remember, he said, I will spew you out of my mouth because you are lukewarm. So the Beatitude before us emphasizes where we stand without Christ. We are all spiritually bankrupt, powerless, helpless, and unable to provide that which we desperately need. And so what are we to do? Well, nothing changes until we see that fact. Our desperate need for God and that which only he can supply. And to be able to receive that, we must be poor in spirit. That is, we must empty self and do away with pride. This first beatitude teaches that we must see that the real problem that we have is self. Pride is a dangerous and a deceptive attitude. It keeps us from admitting what our real problems are. And it is for this reason that Jesus uses language like he does in Matthew chapter 16. In verse number 24, he said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. To deny self, to take up the cross, of course, that brings the picture of crucifixion, which was a horrible death in the first century. And the very fact that Jesus uses that language illustrates how radical this change must be. It's not that we just make a few minor changes in our behavior, that we stop some bad habits. It's a change that occurs from the inside out. I can't afford to think, I'm basically a good person. I mean, I'm better than most people are. I just need to go to church more often. I get rid of this bad habit or start reading my Bible every day or that kind of thing. Or sometimes you'll hear it said about a person who's not a Christian. Well, he's already a good person. All he needs to do is be baptized. That kind of thinking misses the point of this beatitude altogether. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Changed must occur in the heart. Righteousness must be from the inside out. And remember, this is to be a part of God's kingdom because the last half of that verse says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the Sermon on the Mount gives a great deal of information concerning the attitudes that are necessary to enter into the kingdom and also in order to live as a citizen in the kingdom. And this is where it starts, to be poor in spirit. And the Bible gives us examples of those who came to realize what this beatitude teaches. Think, for example, of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. He left home, going to a far country with his part of his father's inheritance, where he wasted it in sinful living. Became so hungry, he joined himself to a citizen of that country that sent him into the field to feed swine. And there, in that far country, destitute, willing to eat what the pigs were eating because he was so hungry, realized that I'm powerless. I'm helpless. I truly am bankrupt. And I need that which only can be provided in my Father's house. There he came to himself, and that's where the change began. The poverty that he was experiencing physically led him to realize of the poverty that was within him spiritually. And there is where change began. Think also the contrast between the Pharisee and the tax collector. In Luke chapter 18, beginning at verse number 9, Jesus taught about two men who went up to the temple to pray. And both of these men, the Pharisee and the tax collector, went up to the temple to pray. But there, the similarities end. Because in one, we see self-deception and pride. That Pharisee was the antithesis of righteousness from the heart. Listen to what Jesus says of him in Luke 18 and beginning at verse number 11. Jesus said, the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Listen to his pride. Listen to him pat himself on the back. In him, you hear someone who trusts in himself that he's righteous. But now contrast the humility that's found in the tax collector. Look at the awareness in him that he's helpless, powerless, and in need of what God alone can provide. Jesus says in verse 13, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And the words of Jesus at the end of this passage are significant. And they speak right to what we are talking about. Look at verse number 14. I tell you, this man, that's the tax collector, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now don't miss in that 14th verse the word justified. It is the word that is also translated righteous in our New Testaments. The Pharisee claimed to be righteous, but Jesus said that he was not. It is the publican who sought righteousness from its only source, that source being God. And Jesus said it was the tax collector who was the one who was justified. He is the one who went down to his house right with God, blessed because he was poor in spirit. Now, one final thought before we wrap this up. One final thought about this beatitude, poor in spirit. And it has to do with the order in which Jesus gives them. It is not arbitrary. It is not haphazard. This beatitude is first for a reason. In fact, it must come first. It must be the foundation of our spiritual life. Unless we first honestly recognize where we stand before God, we'll never be in a position to develop any other of these beatitudes. Unless we are first poor in spirit, we will never be blessed. We'll never be right with God. We'll never be able to live out righteousness from the heart. And that is why Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I thank you for joining me today, and I hope, and it's my prayer that our time together has been helpful to you. Please join me again as we continue these studies, as we continue to study righteousness from the heart. And until that time, may God richly bless you.